But the other thing that it does is mean that you're not doing what we call polluting the experience. So, for example, if you were to say to me that, let's use frightened again, if you were to say to me that you were frightened and I came back and said, okay, so when you're scared, what's happening there? Scared doesn't necessarily mean the same thing as frightened. And I guess it ties back into that curiosity piece where each word means something different for each of us.
If you would like to support the efforts and research we are doing here on this podcast, make a donation using the Buy Me a Coffee link in the show notes or go to buymeacoffee.com/Shane'sBrain. Thank you. Aphantasia is a condition characterized by an inability to visualize mental images in one's mind. If you have just discovered that you or someone you love has aphantasia, or if you're just fascinated by the subject in general and love learning more about it, you are in the right place. The Discovering Your Mind podcast delves into all aspects of the mind's eye, including aphantasia, hyperphantasia, and everything in between. Welcome to the Discovering Your Mind podcast, brought to you by shanesbraindomain.com. I am your host, Shane Williams, also known as Shane's Brain. And today we're talking with the one and only Rebecca McHale. How are you doing there, Rebecca?
I'm good, thank you. I'm really excited to be speaking with you. Thank you for having me.
You are welcome. We are excited to have you on the show. Why don't we start out with you just telling us a little bit about yourself and what you do for a living?
Backtracking slightly, for 10 years I was an architect and a building designer. And then I became sick with ME/CFS in around 2017, 2018. And that completely changed everything. And so I became a therapeutic coach. And now I work with people who have fatigue, chronic illnesses, chronic fatigue and ME and trauma and various bits and bobs that are kind of all linked in with that kind of fatigue theme. So I'm really enjoying that now. And I'm not sure why I spent 10 years in architecture, but I got there in the end.
All right. Very cool. Sometimes it takes a scenic route.
Absolutely.
All right. What about other stuff you like, hobbies and interests, things you like to do for fun?
I guess I have a little bit of an exciting story there because I travel almost full time. So I'm always in like Italy or France or the Netherlands and places like that. And I love it. I love walking in nature and visiting cities. And I'm quite kind of diverse in that way. I like doing both, busy and quiet things. And I really just like exploring new places and learning languages and all of that kind of stuff. So, yeah. Very
cool. So is that separate from your work? Do you travel for your work, or are you just in a position where you just can travel?
My work comes with me. Occasionally, right. I will be in the right place at the right time and be able to work with somebody on my travels in person. But generally, I work over Zoom, which means I can, as long as I have a good internet connection and a quiet space, then I can do that anywhere. So I'm lucky in that way.
Yeah, that is very cool. All right. Why don't you tell us how and when you discovered that you have aphantasia? Just tell us your story a little bit about that.
Yeah. So when I was about 15, my mum said something to me about we were going to decorate my bedroom. And she said to me, I can really see it in purple. And I don't know why in this moment this happened, but at that particular time, I thought, people say phrases like that every now and then, and I don't get it. Are they actually seeing something in their mind? And yeah, I just became curious about what it was that she meant. And I kind of had this part of me that was like, no, you're being a little bit crazy. And I was a little bit crazy at 15 years old in any case. And I had some like wacky ideas. And so I decided to Google it and ask if people really see things in their mind. And nothing came up at all. When was that? What year was that, approximately? My maths is absolutely terrible. It's not on point. So it's 2024 now, and I'm 30.
I'm the same way.
It was before 2015. I know that. It was before it started to become a real known thing. Yeah.
Right. I had a similar thing in 1997 is when I started wondering about it. And yeah, you couldn't find hardly anything about it.
Yeah, and I didn't. And years later, I was speaking with my partner and we were driving, and I remember it, even though I don't have any visualizations, I remember like going around the roundabout and where we were and everything that was around us. And I said to him, when you're imagining something, you're not really kind of seeing what it is that's going on. And he said, what do you mean? And I was like, well, if you're imagining a beach, you're not really seeing a beach, right? And he said, well, of course I am. I'm seeing the beach. I'm hearing the waves. I'm feeling the breeze on my face. And I just went quiet for a minute and I was absolutely mind blown. Well, it turns out my partner actually has hyperphantasia on the other end of the spectrum. So there was the widest gap that there could have been between the two of us.
Yeah, it's the same with me and my wife.
Really? I hear that so often. I wonder if that's a kind of opposites attract type thing. I hear that so often, that somebody has aphantasia and their partners. So my partner, for example, when he is, just when we're in conversation, if I say the word sheep, he's going to be seeing a sheep like vividly, and he's going to be really in that kind of space where he's seeing and feeling and hearing everything. So I wonder how overwhelming or normalized that becomes for other people. But that was really the moment where I was like, okay, there's something different about me here because I don't have any of that. And in the past, I had listened to meditations. My mum bought me CDs when I was having migraines when I was a child once, and she bought me these meditation CDs, and I was listening to them. And I remember kind of noticing that there was always an idea, for example, like allowing the white to wash over your body. And all of those things were just metaphors for me. Right. So it's really interesting looking back once you realize all of those different things that were happening that you just normalized and skipped over because you didn't actually understand.
Right. So when you were 15 and that you had that question, did you ask your mom what she meant by that, or did you just kind of let it go?
No, I thought I was crazy. So I went off and I think it was Ask Jeeves or something that I was using back then. There was no Google, but yeah, I didn't ask her. I was just thinking that I was having a bit of a moment.
Yeah, I had similar experiences because growing up, you come up against it, right? Like all the time, but it never clicked until I was in college and I was in a classroom setting where everyone was talking about it. The teacher was having us visualize and all that. And that was the first moment where I really thought about it and observed everyone else. I think they're seeing it. How long ago was it that you had that conversation with your partner where it clicked?
Yeah, so that was probably just over 6 years ago.
Okay. What about the other senses? Do you experience any of the other senses in your mind?
I don't experience any of the other senses, no.
All right. Yeah, me neither. Let's get into some of the things that you mentioned in your article that was on the Aphantasia Network, right?
Yeah.
So describe the visualization spectrum as you understand it.
Yeah, so speaking about the various different internal senses, I see a spectrum across the idea of no visualization and vivid visualization, but also there seems to be individual experiences for everybody in terms of how those other internal senses are experienced. So some people I've noticed will say they have an inner dialogue or an inner monologue, but it's not audible. And I also have a friend who I was speaking to, and I was asking them to take me through their thought process of something. And he said, but it's not in words. And it took a lot of investigation to figure out how he ever does anything. Right. as I imagine it is for people with hyperphantasia thinking about aphantasia. Like, I don't know about you, but I've had a lot of questions like, well, how do you recognize your parents? How do you enjoy a book if you're not visualizing what's there in it? So
right. I've been asked, how do you think?
Exactly. So yeah, I guess I see that with all of the 5 senses, there is a variety of experience in each of us. So from having none of the internal senses to having some of them, or to having different varieties and aspects to each of those, all the way through to that hyperphantasia that often I've noticed so far comes with also vivid smells and vivid kind of kinesthetic internal, like feeling the wind on your face type things.
I've had similar experiences, and that's really what this podcast is all about. Let's showcase just how beautifully unique everybody is, because I was having similar experiences when I'm talking to people about it. Just everybody's different. I couldn't believe all the things I was discovering, that some people can visualize with their eyes closed and open, but some can do it only one way or the other. Some people are projecting it out in front of them and holding it in their hands. And it was just off the charts. And the more people I talked to, the crazier it got. It was just all over the map. And so when I was listening to, other podcasts and YouTube videos and stuff, they seem to be missing a lot of that, because we can categorize everybody, but at the same time, everybody is a category of their very own, because it's so unique to each person. And that's really what I love about it. And that's why I love talking about it, is because it never ends. Like, there's no final synopsis, right? It's always going. And the more people you talk to, the more you can discover about it.
I guess that's the really great thing about hosting this podcast. You get to ask all of the questions that you want to and really explore it at a depth. When you realize that there's a difference in experience in like having visuals and not having visuals, what else is out there? And all of, like you say, all of those intricacies and all of those differences between everybody. I guess you get to get really creative with your questions so that you can figure out what those experiences are for everybody.
Yeah. And a lot of times I don't know what questions to ask, right? Because I'm coming from nothing. And so a lot of the questions that I have now just come from little interesting things people say. I was like, wow, I've never heard that before. And so I start asking people that, and that's kind of how my questions have evolved. So can you give us a basic overview of what modalities are?
Yeah. Okay. So modalities in neurolinguistic programming and in other areas of psychology are the way that we distinguish our internal and external experience. So we have the 5 senses. Some of us have those internally, and some of us only have those externally. So we've got our visuals, which is what we're seeing, and that can be what I'm seeing in this room now, or for some people it can be what they're seeing in what they might call their mind's eye. And then we've got smell and taste, but predominantly, other than visuals, we've got auditory, which is how we're experiencing sound from externally to our personal experience, but also that idea of internal monologue, or some people can hear music in their minds. I noticed that a lot of people use the term earworm, and I didn't realize until a while ago that what was actually happening was that they were repeatedly hearing a song in their head, and I can't imagine how distracting that can be. Or I guess it can be fun too. So yeah, and then we have the kinesthetic, which is how we're feeling in, for example, sensations in our body. And I know that some people can also imagine sensations. So some people can imagine that they're warm, for example, and actually begin to feel warm. Or they might run their fingers across a fabric in their mind and almost feel as if they're actually touching that fabric. And then we have the internal dialogue, which I guess is the inner monologue. So that's linked in with the auditory piece for some people, but for some people, it's not an auditory thing. And it's, for example, silent words, or some people describe it as like feeling the muscles that would move if they were speaking, but they're not actually verbalizing anything.
Oh, wow. So how is it for you with the auditory? What is it like for you?
So I have no auditory experience internally. I can feel quite sensitive to my external sounds. So if there are a lot of different sounds going on, then I can personally feel relatively overwhelmed with that. But in terms of the internal experience, that's all complete silence for me. During the lockdown, I started playing guitar and I started singing. And that was a really interesting experience for me, because the people who were around me that were also playing various instruments were asking me, well, if you can't hear it inside, how do you know what it is that you're going to play? How do you know that this note is these fingers and that's what it's going to sound like? How do you decide what it is that, what chords you're going to play together? And I had to think about it for a while and reflect on it. And I realized that I have that kinesthetic feeling in my throat. So I know what it feels like to hum a certain sound. And I connect that with the sound that I would make with the string. So I guess I create a memory of like an association between the two. Does that make sense?
Yeah, kind of. but that's really interesting. I don't think I've ever heard anybody say that before either. That's
So
very
far, I
interesting.
haven't either.
Yeah, that is really cool, actually. So when you think, would you say that you think in concepts or words or both or something else?
I would say almost a 50-50 blend of both. So I will remember things in words, and I will also link that up with a concept. So I guess I'm merging the two in a way. And I'm trying to think of an example of what I really mean by that. So if I were to think of an apple, I have a memory from holding an apple previously and a list of the attributes of that apple. So I know that it's shiny, it's hard, that it's got a stalk coming out of it. And those are words that I have lumped together to become what means to me an apple.
Okay. How can people with aphantasia deal with being misunderstood or dismissed when telling other people about it?
The way that I do this, if it's really important to me that the other person understands my experience, is that I get playful with it. So I went to the park with a few of my friends when I was studying, because my tutor, when I went to her to say, okay, I've got to learn about all these internal experiences that people have, but I don't have it. So how am I going to work with anybody if I don't get what's going on inside for them? And she said, you need to create your own map. And that was kind of all she had for me at the time, because she hadn't come across anybody who didn't have internal experiences. So I went out and I did a bit of an experiment, I guess. And I asked a group of my friends to all, and I did this separately. So some of them we walked away, and we did it like with me and one other person, one at a time. So they couldn't hear what each other was saying in answer to my questions. And I was asking them to visualize, I think it might have been an apple actually. And I had one person answer me and say that, they were seeing it as a kind of overlay to what they were seeing in real life, so that they were seeing what they were seeing in front of them, but they were also seeing this apple. I had some people close their eyes and were able to visualize it, and only visualize it by closing their eyes. I had some people who it was a blurry image, and some of them it was very vivid. Some of them it was 2D, some of them it was 3D. And there are all these various aspects to it. And then one of the interesting things for me was the kinesthetic part of it, because one of the people that I was speaking with could feel the apple in their hands, and they could, notice the texture of the skin of it and things like that. And this didn't give me any clarity whatsoever, because I thought that what I was going to find out is that everybody kind of sees in a relatively similar way, whether it's eyes closed, eyes open, vivid, 2D, 3D. I thought that there were going to be some patterns, and there were no patterns. And so we came together afterwards, and everybody shared what it was that they had experienced. And it opened up this long conversation where everybody became really curious about it. And it was no longer then about specifically me having aphantasia and no visuals. It was about us all having a different experience. And I think that made it an easier concept for people to grasp if we were all having something different rather than just this one person. Because when you have one person in front of you saying something, generally you're interpreting it from your own belief systems, right? So if you can see, then if I can see, then you can see. But this kind of negated that, and it took it away, because we were all having different experiences. It wasn't just me, the anomaly that, thought that I couldn't see in my mind or anything like that anymore. It made it easier to understand that there was a difference for all of us, and that I was just on like one end of the spectrum.
Yeah, I love that. And I've noticed that as well. It goes over so much better in a group setting. In that setting, you're right. It's just all of a sudden everybody's so engaged, and everybody just instantly can understand. Nobody's saying the same thing. Everybody is different. And I've done some workshops as well where I've got a group full of people who have never heard about this before. And you just start asking the questions and say, raise your hand if this, raise your hand if that. And you can just look around the room and just instantly see everybody is different and unique. So I think you're right. It does make it easier for people to accept. Again, everybody assumes that everybody's like they are. I did. Everybody I've talked to does. Yeah, I just thought everybody was like me. So yeah, I think that's a good point you bring up. I love that. All right. Let's talk about the 5 principles that practitioners can use to break down some of those barriers. So you listed there curiosity, validation, trust, language, and flexibility. Can you talk about each one of those individually for a bit?
Yeah. So with the curiosity piece, my suggestion and what I find works really well is to never make assumptions. And that's really difficult, right? Because our brains literally work by creating these blocks of information, which mean that we can understand things. Because if we knew absolutely everything about everything, then we wouldn't have very much mental capacity left over. So we make assumptions every day without realizing it. We assume, for example, that we're going to get up in the morning. We assume that we're going to work. We assume that someone else is doing what they usually do at this time of the day. And so sometimes it takes a little bit of practice and kind of exercising your mind a little in just stepping back and not assuming anything. And that allows us to be curious and to ask questions that mean that the other person can explain to us as well as they can what it is that's going on for them. So I guess it's about asking really good questions and then asking questions that spin off of those questions. And you've obviously got very good at doing that, having a podcast. But when somebody says something to you, even in the words that they're using, so for example, somebody in a therapy session might tell me that they're feeling frightened. Well, the idea of feeling frightened for me and the idea of feeling frightened for them might be very different things. So it might be that when I'm frightened, my heart's racing and my mind stops working properly and I'm feeling confused. But it might be when someone else is frightened that their experience is entirely different. So I guess for me, curiosity means picking up on key words that people say and then just asking them, what does that word mean for you? And we're still, the funny thing is, no matter how curious we are, we're still going to have our own interpretation of their description of what that was. So it's never like we can truly 100% be with them, but we can be closer with them than we are without being curious, if that makes sense.
That's very good because, again, when you're talking about words, I've identified that as like one of the biggest obstacles that we have. We all use the same words, we all use the same phrases, but they all mean something different to us. And I've really highlighted that, throughout the podcast. I ask people about certain phrases and what they mean to them. And it's all over the map because the internal experience is so different that we hear these phrases and we internalize it and it becomes what it means to us, but we don't realize that it doesn't mean that to everybody else. So I love that. And yeah, curiosity, that's the only way to get there, right? Otherwise, the wall is up, right? All right. What about validation?
Yeah. So validation in my story, in terms of aphantasia, firstly, my partner just believed me. He just became really curious actually straight away. And he asked a lot of questions. But I've been to see therapists who I will tell them at the beginning of the first session that I don't visualize and I don't have internal senses. And then we'll get a few sessions in and they may say something to me like, I know you don't feel like you have visualizations, but, and then they'll ask me a question, which is then gearing me towards having a visualization, which for me is just not going to happen, as you know. And that's a real rapport breaker, because I'm on the assumption that I've told this person something, they're going to take it at face value for what it is, and that they're going to enter my model of the world for the work that we're going to do together. My opposite experience of that was that I went to see a hypnotherapist at one point in my recovery journey from MECFS, and I told her that I don't visualize. And so she asked me questions about that. None of those questions were questioning my reality. It was from a place of trying to gain understanding. And she accepted that was where I was at, and she tailored her approach to what it was that I needed. So there was no assumption of internal senses, and she changed all of her scripts to suit me. And I found that experience extremely healing in that somebody was really seeing me, and I was able to then put my trust in her because I could see that she was putting into practice things that validated what my experience was, as opposed to the experience before that I'd had where I went into the therapy session, told her, thought that it had been accepted, and then a few sessions later found out that it wasn't. I had evidence that she was accepting that was the way that things are for me, and that was the way we were going to work because of that. So I think it's really important for me to ensure that the person in front of me knows that I get it, or at least that if I don't get it, that I believe that that is their experience. Even if I don't fully know what that experience feels like, I believe them that that's their experience. And that creates that environment of trust between the two of you. That means that you can do much deeper work and you don't break that rapport.
Right. That is so important. And I wasn't going to do this, but I'm going to do this because I want to see your reaction to this. So just a little background. So I bought somebody's book one time, and the way he teaches, the way his process, it's all about visualization, right? So, but when I bought the book, he gave me a link to like some other video and audio stuff that he'd done. So I turned one of these on, and I want you to listen to what he said, and I want to get your reaction to it because it's right along these lines that you're talking about there.
Now, some people say to me that they can't visualize or they don't know how to create a feeling in their body. So let's do a little exercise before we begin. I want you to think about a memorable moment in your life. Birth of a child, a birthday celebration, a graduation, the first time you left home, your first kiss. Maybe it's something negative, September 11, being broken up with. The first time you went traveling, that could be something cool. I want you to think of a memory, and I want you to do that right now. Think of a memory that you just remember you either love or really don't love. I want you to notice that as you think about that, you can get the thought, you can get a picture or a movie in your mind, and it's associated with a feeling. Am I right? I know I'm right, because you're not so special that you're the only human on the planet that can't do this. Every single human on this planet can do this. We can tune our mind and create the way that we think and create the way we feel.
All right. That used to really tick me off every time I listen to it, but I'm getting better. What do you think?
So I'm wondering, so I know that or at least last time I looked, it was generally accepted that like somewhere between 3 and 5% of people had aphantasia. I don't know about you, but my experience is that it's a significant proportion more than that.
I feel like it's more.
For me, it feels more. I don't want to put a number on it, but it definitely feels like it's significantly more. And so I'd be curious to know, and we'll never find out, but how many people were in that room listening to that and had completely broken the rapport with him, because he then says, am I right? There's going to be a variety of responses from people internally, right? From like, oh, wow, I really am a strange person. Why can't I do this? What's wrong with me? And all of those kind of questions where you start to feel like he was very confident that he's right. Like, was this a room full of people that he was doing this with?
I'm not sure. It was just an audio, so I don't know if there were people there or not.
I'm just imagining how some people may have made sense of that experience and of listening to that. And I'm wondering how many people decided that they really were quite strange because he was very sure that they could experience it and they wouldn't have been.
Right. Okay, let's go to the next one. Trust. Do you have anything more to say on that, on trust?
Not really, I guess. Trust really, for me, fits in with the validation piece. If somebody is validating your experience, then I'm trusting that we're going to continue on the basis that you get what it is that I'm experiencing and that I get what it is that you're experiencing. And that creates that trust that I kind of demonstrated was broken in the previous therapy sessions.
Right. And that's so true, because that audio that we just listened to, that happens, right? As soon as he didn't validate my experience, I didn't trust him. You know, I turned it off. Like, I'm done, right? You lost me. So yeah, they're tied together for sure. Share the gift of laughter with your children and grandchildren with books full of funny poetry and silly stories by Shane D. Williams, available on shanesbraindomain.com. All right, let's talk about language.
Yeah. So in my sessions with clients, I use what we call clean language. And it's not my concept, but it's a concept that I very much buy into, and I find it really valuable in my work. And what clean language means is using the language of your client. So it's using the language of the person in front of you. One thing that does is gain you rapport. But the other thing that it does is mean that you're not doing what we call polluting the experience. So, for example, if you were to say to me that, let's use frightened again, if you were to say to me that you were frightened and I came back and said, okay, so when you're scared, what's happening there? Scared doesn't necessarily mean the same thing as frightened. And I guess it ties back into that curiosity piece where each word means something different for each of us. It's kind of the same thing that ties in there when we're using clean language. So we're using the language of our client, which means that they feel like we're really getting what it is that they're saying, because there's a potential of them feeling like we don't get what they're saying if we start to supplement those words for words that we think mean the same thing. It allows us to also, as a therapist, enter the world of that client and experience things the way that they experience it when we're only using their language. And I find it really important to be able to do that, because when a client's telling me what it is that they're experiencing, if I'm sitting in their model of the world and not mine, then I can also see other things that kind of spread out from that, like what that means for various other aspects of what's going on.
Okay. So how do you get better at that? Because that's something I feel like I could get better at.
Yeah, I would say that it's really like anything that we do. Everything that we do for the first time generally is kind of a bit foreign. It's a bit tricky. We don't have a flow of it. And then we start to get more consciously competent at doing it. And then we start to realize where we can refine that, and we get better and better at it. And I would say that using clean language for me is just that. And it doesn't mean that I always get it right even now, even though I've been doing it for years. I often will use a replacement word and then I'll skip back and say, oh, actually what you said was this. And I'll jump back and make sure that you know, that they know that I'm on their page and I did hear them. So I guess it's not about being able to every single time use the person in front of you that use their words. It's more about just creating a consciousness around trying to, and that becomes easier and easier over time.
Yeah. And throughout the podcast, I've played around a lot with the words because it's so intriguing to me, but I really don't ever know what I'm going to get. So, for example, when I first started out, I was asking people to picture a horse in their mind. And then one person told me, well, when you say picture, that makes me look at it as a picture. If you had said a different word, something else would have happened. So I switched it and I started saying visualize it. And then I changed it again and said, imagine it, right? I keep changing it just to see what'll happen and how different people. And now I ask them, all of them, like, is there a difference between what I say, right? So it's very interesting to me. And I want your opinion on one of them real quick, because one of the things I ask when we're talking about the other senses is I ask, on a scale from 1 to 10, how much is it like actual hearing? Or how much is it like actual smelling? Or how close is it to reality? Because that's the only way I know how to ask it, right? Because I'm just trying to understand what the heck is going on in people's mind. And reality is all I have to compare it to. But someone with hyperphantasia recently told me that he doesn't really like the way I asked that. And he said a better way to ask it would be to ask, how vivid is it? And I was like, I hate the word vivid, because that's one that means that I already know that means something different to everybody. So my question to you is, do you think I'm asking that the right way, or do you have any ideas of how to ask that in a better way that might get better results? I know I'm putting you on the spot there, but
no, it's a good question. And off the top of my head, I feel like I often use a scale of 1 to 10 to do things. My clients will tell you, I love a scale of 1 to 10. And then I do it for various things. So I think it's an awesome way of doing it. I guess something that I might add into it, if I was being conscious about tweaking it and refining it, would be to begin with the question of asking them what the real experience is, so that we know what then the internal experience is in comparison when we've got that scale.
Okay, that's interesting.
And this might be a really tricky question for some people to articulate. So it might also need some kind of prompting along the way. And it might not just be the one singular question that gets you your answer. But I guess I would specifically start with, when you are hearing something, for example, music or a family member talking to you, can you describe to me the experience of hearing?
Okay.
And then see what they come out with.
But yeah, that's interesting. I could probably explore that a little bit more. I appreciate that input. All right, where are we at? We got flexibility. Can we talk about that one?
Yeah, so flexibility for me in a therapeutic setting is around being able, I guess, having a broad enough toolkit and some creativity sometimes, sometimes a lot of creativity, so that you can take a process that was probably created with the fact that the person in front of you can visualize in mind, and then altering it so that it suits the person that you're working with. I guess what I mean by that is, for example, sometimes in my sessions, I'll do timeline work. Have you heard of timeline work before?
No.
Okay, so it's essentially when we're working with past memories and we're healing that memory so that we can bring it right back through to the present moment without having all of the experience that happened after that memory being tainted. And so that don't worry if that didn't make any sense, because it doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. But what traditionally happens in timeline therapy is that you might, for example, visualize your past, your present, and your future on a line, whether that be the future is in front of you and the past is behind you, or the future is on your left and the past is on you. It doesn't matter. For everybody, that is an individual experience. But what traditionally happens is that you will perhaps float up. Imagine yourself floating up above that timeline and then traveling back towards the memory and maybe dropping down into the memory. And so probably anybody with aphantasia listening to that is thinking, well, how am I supposed to do that? And so the flexibility piece is in being able to do processes like that without the need to visualize. So, for example, I had a client who was very kinesthetic, and that means that they feel, they can imagine feelings, and they can, that internal experience of sensation is there. And so they were able to imagine, and this is where what you were saying about the subtle nuances and what different words mean for different people. But in their own way, they imagined floating up and moving back down the timeline and dropping down into the memory. And that didn't mean that they were visualizing it. It meant that in their body, they had the sensation that they were doing it. So the flexibility piece is really about using all of those aforementioned pieces about curiosity and validation and language, and using that to inform us about how we can be flexible about using processes that are going to land well with the person in front of you and their own experience and how they can possibly do it.
Okay, very good. So you've got a handle on this, and I really love your approach and the way you work with your clients and your understanding of it all. So how do we get there with other people? Because I know that there's so many other therapists or educators or gurus, you name it, who are blissfully unaware of any of this. So do you have any ideas on how we move forward and get more people aware of it and aware of these specific things that you've just talked about?
Yeah, so in my personal work, I spread the word as much as I possibly can. When I was studying, my tutor invited me to do a session on aphantasia and how that works for everybody else and how that works for them within the therapeutic setting, working with their clients. It's an exciting opportunity to be able to teach hundreds of practitioners what it means to work with people with aphantasia. And it will also support people who don't have aphantasia but are just on that spectrum, of a variety of the different internal experiences. Because some processes, for example, in therapy might be led by saying something like, say to yourself in your mind, X, Y, Z, and that's different for everybody. So it would be useful not only, in my opinion, not only to spread the awareness of aphantasia, but to spread the awareness of the spectrum as a whole. And what I do is that I literally just tell everybody that I possibly can about it without being too boring or sticking it in where it doesn't fit. But so, for example, I'm part of a collective of coaches who support each other in various different ways. So, for example, if I have a client who is dealing with grief, then the way that I see things is that if I'm not the best person to be working with you on this, I want you to be working with the best person who can be doing it. I can work with grief, but I'm not the expert in grief. And so I would refer to someone else, and we have a kind of system there where we all get to support each other in understanding. And I might just need a little bit of support in the area of grief, and I will ask that coach or that therapist to give me some insights. And so within those conversations, I'm always sharing this piece around aphantasia, and I'm always sharing around the spectrum, especially in neurolinguistic programming, because it really focuses on those modalities, and it does have the underlying assumption that everybody has those internal experiences of visualizing and hearing. And so I guess for me, I create the awareness within those communities that I'm part of in a way that means that those people can work with their clients in a more effective way. And I think the kind of butterfly effect of that is that it's a well-known thing that for therapists and for coaches, referrals are our biggest source. If we do a good job, somebody's going to go to dinner and they're going to tell their friends. So the more people that get to tell other people, the wider it's going to spread. So it's not just about me telling the coaches and the therapists, it's about their clients telling their friends and their family. And even if they're just telling them about the piece where they felt validated, it's still a conversation where we get to gain some awareness about the fact that we are different in all of our individual ways that we are.
Right. That's huge. And I love that you're doing that. All right. So I want to talk about a few of the specific things that many people with aphantasia struggle with. Just see if you have any insights on some of these. So you just mentioned grieving. That's one of them. Grieving loved ones who have passed away. What do you think people with aphantasia have as a challenge, or maybe not a challenge in that regard?
Yeah, so I see kind of two, maybe more threads that come off of this subject in a way, because some people are only just realizing that they have aphantasia, and some people know or have known for a long time. I think it also, how you would work with it from my perspective, also depends on whether, when the person passed away, whether the individual who's left with the grief knew that they could or couldn't visualize, that it was a thing. So there's a grief in itself around the idea that you've lost all this time where you didn't realize that you weren't visualizing and that everyone else was, and what you could have done differently if you had known. So for example, I might have done better in school if I'd have been taught in a way that was more suitable for aphantasia. And there's a grief around the lost time and the lost potential and all of that kind of stuff. And I think that feeds into how we would experience grief when somebody passes. Like, do we know at that point in time that we could have been visualizing, that if we were someone else, we might have visualized? Do we know that everyone else is able to visualize their loved ones? I guess the experience is individual. So I've met some people who the biggest thing that they're sad about when they realize that they have aphantasia is that other people can see, their mum who has passed away, and they can't see their mum. And for other people, they know that that's always been their experience, and they're at peace with that, and it's nothing's changed for them. And I guess it's a little bit like, sometimes when people get like a chronic illness diagnosis, they're like, okay, fine, I've got a label for it. But I was already having that experience anyway. So like, I already had the symptoms. I already had the rashes or the pain or whatever it was. Now I just have a name for it. But for other people, there's a different experience where they're like, oh no, now I have this condition. And it changes the meaning of it. So I guess my answer to that is I don't have a specific answer, because it would be really individual to who it is that's experiencing the grief and the loss and how that's interpreted and felt for them.
Right. And that's the perfect answer, because like we've talked about how everybody's so unique, but sometimes we have a hard time getting there, right? Like, because even with me with aphantasia, sometimes I fall into that trap of, oh, you have aphantasia too, so you must be like me, right? So when we talk about the grief, I love that you go into all of those different options or scenarios. All right, excuse my ignorance on this one. When I was reading through your article, you mentioned a couple other things, and I wasn't sure if they were linked to the grief thing or separate things. So I'll just ask you about them and see what you have to say on those. Okay, you talked about wasted time as they were growing up as something that people with aphantasia struggle with. And I'm not sure what you mean by that. So could you explain that?
Yeah. So what I mean by that is that, I guess, similarly to something we just mentioned, if we don't find out that we have aphantasia until what we would call too late for some people, what that really means is that if they had known earlier, then things could have been different. And so, for example, I could say that if I had realized that I had aphantasia, I never would have become an architectural technician, because my day was spent drawing buildings from all these different angles and cutting lines through them and all of those things. And I found that hard. I found that really difficult. And I made it mean that I wasn't as intelligent as the people who were around me. That was the way that was my answer to it. I didn't realize that they were visualizing and I wasn't. I just wasn't as intelligent as they are, because they were doing it faster than me. They were doing it easier than me. They weren't needing to ask each other questions like I was. So I would be like, well, how does this staircase look if you turn that way and you know, look from that angle? And I couldn't understand how anybody was so easily doing that. And I had some people in the office who were just twiddling it in their mind. I mean, I'm sure my partner would say to you, he's just put it on a little spinner and he's watching it go around and he just sees what it looks like. But for me, it was like I was using maths and I was using trigonometry and I was using, you know, I was working with angles and I was doing all of this kind of extra steps that meant that I was finding it exhausting where everyone else was finding it enjoyable and creative. And so I don't, but I could potentially feel like I had wasted a lot of time because I didn't know. So I wasted a lot of time doing something that I didn't enjoy, something that I did difficult, that I found difficult. But similarly, that idea of if we knew when we were in school, then perhaps we would have achieved more of our potential. We might have got the grades that we feel like we should have got. And there's just all of these kind of things that I guess we tell ourselves along the way to make sense of what's going on when we don't actually know that we have aphantasia, but we know that there's something different about our experience or the outcome of having it. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's very insightful. So let's talk about school a little bit more. Just your personal experience. Did you do well in school? Did you struggle?
So I did well in school and I struggled to get there. So, and it's something that I still work on now. Just because I'm a therapist, it doesn't mean that, you know, I've figured everything out. So we're all a work in progress, right? And the same is true for me. So when I was in school, I felt like I had to work so much harder than everyone else to get the same grade. And I did very well by spending my entire evening and sometimes through into the early hours of the morning trying to figure something out or trying to get the answers, you know, get the answers down for my homework or write the thing or create the thing or whatever it was. And I knew that everyone else was just going home and spending half an hour or an hour on it. And I was spending 5 hours on it. And I made that mean that I wasn't intelligent. I just decided, well, that must just mean that I'm not intelligent because I can do the thing, but it means that I have to spend all of this effort doing it. And that is something I have to actively remind myself of and continually work to heal on. And eventually I will get there where it will become my new normal where that is not the case. But for example, I might take an exam now and assume that I'm going to have to put a lot of effort into it because I'm not very intelligent. And then I catch myself and I'm like, no, you know that that's not true. You just need to do it in your own way, the way that works for you. And I know what those ways are now. So I guess I'm catching up with myself still on the things that I've learned to believe because I didn't know that I had aphantasia.
That is beautiful. All right. So I'm curious, you talked about the 10 years as an architect. Was it during or after that you learned about aphantasia? Had you already left that career when you learned about aphantasia, or were you still in it at the time?
There's not a straightforward answer to that because it was around the same time that I became unwell with ME/CFS. Okay. So I was still employed there, but I wasn't doing the same work. I was doing a little bit of admin here and there because I wasn't well enough to go into the office for 45, 50 hours a week. So I was no longer doing the building design stuff where I had to, or you know, ideally would be visualizing. And so I had left my job in that capacity by the time I found out. There was a crossover.
Right. That's what I was wondering is when did the light bulb come on? Because I'm sure at some point you said, oh, that's why I've struggled at this. I'm sure that happened. So I was just wondering when that happened, if you were still in the job or had already gone. Did that realization help you transition and decide, I'm going to go do something else?
Yes and no. It was part of it. Yeah. I guess a lot of the listeners here might resonate with this, but when you go through an experience that changes your life and changes your abilities and, takes a lot away from you, you grow a lot and you realize a lot and you think a lot. And there's a heap of reflections and transitions that go on within your mind, even though it's an awful experience to become unwell to the point where, your life as you know it ceases to exist. In a way, many people also describe it as a gift, because it means that you break away from a lot of the things that you didn't realize weren't healthy for you because you were just doing them mindlessly. When I say mindlessly, I don't mean that, we just never thought about it. It's just that we're thinking about it differently. I saw myself as a businesswoman who was one of the only women in the industry at the time, and I thrived on that and I enjoyed it. And I would make jokes about people thinking that I was the receptionist when, I really wasn't. And I would be the only woman on site, and I was the youngest person, and all of these kind of things. And they were valuable to me. I felt like those things made me quite special. As I became ill, those things couldn't be part of me anymore because I wasn't in that position. And I found other things that make me feel good and that satisfy me and make me feel like my values are being met. And so the importance of myself at that point became different. So I became somebody who wasn't the businesswoman who went to London and was the only woman in the industry and all that, the youngest and all of that kind of stuff. I was the person who was very in tune with how she was feeling. I was very in tune with how other people are feeling. I became more aware about dynamics between relationships and all of that kind of stuff. And that healing journey was really the bulk of my decision to leave where I was working. It wasn't necessarily just the aphantasia piece, although that did come into play because I was looking for ways of saving energy going forward. And I was using a lot of energy doing something that wasn't very well suited to me because I had to do a lot of extra work to get the same result.
Okay. I like that. Very well put. All right. How can unhealed emotions, inner conflicts, and traumas contribute to fatigue and anxiety?
What I see in many of my clients is that when we experience something that's traumatic, it doesn't have to be a big life event. It doesn't have to be that we witnessed a death or that we experienced abuse. It's more about the way that we experienced it and processed it or didn't, or the amount that we were able to process it at the time. That's what affects us and means that it's a trauma, that it was traumatic. So it could be that it was very subtle things that were happening over a long period of time that became a traumatic experience for us. And so when we have those kind of experiences and we don't process them, the body doesn't forget. It's not just disappeared and ended up nowhere. It's in us still, whether we have a regular consciousness of it or not. And what we can often do with experiences that are traumatic is push them down because they are too difficult to be able to bring to the surface and process, or we're not comfortable with doing that, or it doesn't feel safe. And so when that stores within us, it means that it's taking energy. It's a load on our body in the same way that going to work takes a certain amount of our energy. It might create energy too, but it's using energy. Whatever it is that we do is using a certain amount of energy, and our body creates, if we're a healthy, well-functioning body, then our body will either create more energy than we're using, or it will create an equal amount so that we're not lacking in energy. But when we have too many things draining our energy, we can then actually deplete it. So we're not creating new energy fast enough, or we're not replenishing that energy. And so trauma is one of those things that becomes like a weight that pulls down the amount of energy capacity that we actually have.
Okay. All right. I just want to ask you a few other questions here. I want to shift a little bit to just asking questions more about you and how you experience aphantasia. Can you think of nothing if you want to?
For a very fleeting amount of time, yes, I can. I've spent a lot of time meditating over the last few years. So yes, I can. It doesn't hold for very long.
Is it easy for you to stay in the present moment?
Yes. Again, because I've had a lot of therapy and I've done a lot of healing work. And one of the things that I found to be really important is that I'm not spending too much time in the past where I'm not changing anything. I can visit the past because I'm particularly looking to heal something, or I'm enjoying a memory. and I can look to the future to become excited about something. But there is also a potential when we're looking into the future a lot. There's a potential to have anxiety because we're forward planning, and that takes energy. And it's a pattern that I try to rewire so that being in the present moment is the most important thing. And I believe we experience the most when we're in the present moment, because there's nothing like having a conversation with somebody and realizing they're thinking about what they're having for dinner later or whatever else it is. So right. I really enjoy presence. It means that I have a richer experience of life, and it means that I connect with people on a level that I wouldn't if I hadn't been practicing being there.
Okay. Have you ever had any moment of visualization or something outside the norm, something that you're like, whoa, that was different? Have you ever had any moments like that?
Yes, I believe we have answers for this one. And I'm not alone in this experience for somebody who has aphantasia. In those moments where you're not quite awake and not quite asleep, I guess I'm almost in a dreaming state, but I'm conscious of it. And at that point, I feel like I'm really seeing something that isn't there. And I try to practice holding that for as long as possible and seeing what I can do with it. But again, it's fleeting and it doesn't last for very long. So I know that there's a separation between the mind's eye as we're talking about it and a dreaming state. So I guess the answer is yes and no.
Okay. Yeah, I like that. I've had very small, brief glimpses of that too. As someone with aphantasia, how do you memorize something?
I personally find it tricky to answer this one. And I asked my partner how he would describe that I remember things. And he says that he believes that I have a filing cabinet, a massive filing cabinet back there somewhere in my mind that stores all of the information and categorizes it. So, you know how we were talking about an apple, it might be green, it's, relatively solid, it's got a stalk. That's one file that I've got. And I've also got subcategory folders in there that have a variety of those different things in them, depending on what the subject is. So it might be that I've got one for apples, but I've also got that's a subcategory for fruit, for example. But I would describe it that I remember a sequence of words that are the description of something. But I also have memories being anchored to emotions. So if I have a certain emotion, that will trigger a memory that I have. Similarly with smells, I don't have an internal sense of smell, but if I smell a perfume that I smelled 10 years ago, then I can remember this time I was in a nightclub and there was a girl wearing that perfume or whatever it was.
Okay. It seems fairly organized. Is that a good assumption?
Yeah. Organization's one of my skills, I would say.
Okay. What do you think are some upsides and some downsides of having aphantasia?
For me, I guess the upside is that I only have what currently in my mind. Some people I know, often people have visualizations that they didn't actively choose to have. They didn't consciously create. So I quite like the quietness of not having that. So for example, when I'm traveling with my partner in a car, if we have a near miss and a car is potentially going to crash into us but doesn't, in his mind's eye plays out the scenario where it did happen. So I'm really pleased that doesn't happen for me. I'm feeling quite grateful for not having to experience that. So I guess there's an upside there. The downside for me, I guess, would be that it takes time to understand how I work best in various different scenarios. And it takes some practice and some playing around with different ways of doing things before I know what way really works for me. And I guess other people have that in their own way. So I don't know if it's a specific downside of aphantasia, because everybody has their own way of learning, of absorbing information, of doing. Maybe we have an additional thing to need to do there with having aphantasia, but maybe not.
All right, last question. If you could wave a magic wand and get rid of your aphantasia, would you do it?
No, absolutely not. I'm fine.
All right. I'm right there with you. I've always been at peace with it.
Yeah.
All right, Rebecca, that is pretty much it. Is there anything else you would like to say or talk about before we sign off?
No, I feel like you've asked me some really great questions. You've really got me thinking today, so thank you. And yeah, I really appreciate you having me on. And I've been listening to some of your work and I'm finding it really valuable. So yeah, just thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
You are welcome, and thank you for coming on. It was a really great interview. We were able to get into some things that I never have before. You were very articulate and very thoughtful, and I've really enjoyed it, and I appreciate your time. If you like what you hear, please subscribe, follow, and engage with us, and share it with your friends and family as we continue to explore this fascinating subject. For additional information about this episode or Shane's Brain, check out the show notes. Thanks for listening to the Discovering Your Mind podcast. You are beautifully unique.